There is a strange moment that happens when you begin changing your life. I haven't done anything to them. Sometimes the answer is not that you became difficult. It is that the relationship was built around a version of you that no longer exists. This is an important distinction. Changing yourself does not automatically mean becoming better than other people. It does not mean everyone who disagrees with you is insecure. And it certainly does not mean every negative reaction proves that you are doing the right thing. Stoicism demands more honesty than that. Before blaming someone else, examine yourself. Have you actually become more disciplined? Are you communicating more clearly? Are you keeping your commitments? Are you treating people fairly? Or have you simply become careless and started calling it independence? That question matters, because genuine growth and selfish behavior can sometimes look similar from the outside. The difference is found in your character. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly focused on governing his own conduct rather than trying to manage the reactions of everyone around him. That principle becomes especially important when your behavior begins changing the expectations people have of you. Imagine someone who has always answered every request immediately. One day, they begin protecting their time. They still care. They still help when they reasonably can, but they no longer abandon everything whenever someone asks. The people around them may need time to adjust. Not necessarily because those people are malicious. They may simply have become accustomed to a certain pattern. And when the pattern changes, everyone has to discover what the new relationship looks like. Epictetus gives us a useful way to approach this. Your responsibility is to govern your own choices. You are not responsible for making every person comfortable with your development. But you are responsible for making sure your development is actually guided by reason. That means you do not change merely to provoke a reaction. You do not become distant to make someone chase you. Tactic. You do not pretend not to care simply because you want someone to notice your absence. That is not Stoic strength. That is another form of being controlled by someone else's reaction. Real change is quieter. You change because your priorities have become clearer. You change because certain habits no longer fit the person you are trying to become. You change because you have learned from experience. And when others respond differently, you observe rather than immediately retaliate. Seneca understood that a person's character becomes clearer when circumstances test it. The same is true when relationships change. Your growth may reveal which connections were built on genuine mutual respect and which depended heavily on old expectations. Some relationships will adapt. Some will become healthier. Some may naturally become more distant. Your task is not to force any particular outcome. It is to remain honest about who you are becoming. Because the real question is not, how can I make people lose control when I change? The real question is, can I change without becoming controlled by their reaction? That is where this journey begins. People often become comfortable with patterns long before they become aware that those patterns exist. Maybe you were always the one who said yes. You answered every call. You solved problems that were not yours. You apologized first. You explained yourself whenever someone questioned you. You adjusted your plans to accommodate everyone else. Over time, people may begin treating that behavior as normal. Not necessarily because they consciously decided to use you. Sometimes, a pattern becomes an expectation. Then you change. You start saying no when something genuinely does not fit your responsibilities. You stop volunteering for every problem. You take longer before answering. You make decisions based on your own priorities. Nothing about this automatically makes you unkind, but the familiar arrangement has changed. And when an arrangement changes, some people react. This is where the video's title needs an important qualification. Not everyone who reacts strongly is trying to control you. Sometimes people are simply surprised. Sometimes they need time to understand the change. Sometimes your previous behavior affected them in ways you did not realize. And sometimes, yes, a person may have become dependent on the version of you that always accommodated them. The Stoic response is not to immediately assume the worst. It is to observe. Epictetus taught the importance of examining our judgments rather than immediately accepting our first impression. So when someone reacts to your change, do not instantly decide, they are threatened by my growth. Ask something more useful. What actually happened? Perhaps they asked you to do something, you declined, they became disappointed. That does not automatically mean manipulation. Maybe they were simply accustomed to your previous answer. Give the situation enough room to reveal itself. But watch what happens next. If someone can accept your decision, even when they dislike it, be no deeper problem. They may disagree and still respect you. That is normal. But if someone repeatedly pressures you to return to your old behavior, becomes angry whenever you make an independent decision, or treats your changed priorities as a personal offense, then you have learned something important about the previous dynamic. Marcus Aurelius understood that a person's responsibility is to live according to reason rather than constantly adjusting themselves to every external demand. That does not mean refusing cooperation. It means knowing why you are cooperating. There is a difference between generosity and automatic availability. There is a difference between kindness and permanent accommodation. There is a difference between being dependable and becoming responsible for everything. When you begin recognizing those differences, your behavior naturally changes, and people who were accustomed to the old arrangement may notice. Imagine an employee who used to accept every extra task without question. They stayed late, they cover every absence, they rarely declined anything. Then they realize their own responsibilities are suffering. So they begin setting a reasonable schedule. They continue doing good work, they still help when appropriate, but they stop absorbing every additional demand. A colleague might complain, a manager might be surprised. Someone may even say, "You have changed." Perhaps they are right, but changing is not automatically a problem. The more important question is whether the change has made you more responsible or less responsible. That is the standard worth examining. Seneca's philosophy gives us a useful perspective here. Your conduct should be guided by judgment, not by the desire to maintain everyone's approval. If your previous role required you to constantly abandon your own priorities, returning to it simply because someone is uncomfortable would not necessarily be virtuous. You can acknowledge their disappointment without surrendering your decision. You can say, "I understand that this is different from before, but this is what I can reasonably do now." No hostility. No dramatic announcement. No attempt to punish anyone. Just clarity. And that is important because changing your behavior should not become another strategy for controlling other people. You do not change so they will panic. You do not become unavailable so they will chase you. You do not withdraw kindness so someone will finally appreciate you. You change because the old behavior no longer reflects your responsibilities or principles. That makes the change much harder for others to manipulate. There is nothing dramatic about becoming more deliberate. You simply stop performing a role that no longer fits. Some people will adjust. Some will question you. Some may resist. Allow them to reveal which one they are. Your responsibility is not to force them to accept the new version of your life. It is to make sure that the new version is actually worth becoming. One of the most noticeable changes in a person is not becoming louder. It is becoming less predictable in the ways that once made them easy to provoke. Maybe you used to argue whenever someone criticized you. They knew exactly which words would irritate you. Perhaps you became defensive whenever someone questioned your decisions. They knew you would immediately explain yourself. Maybe you reacted to every message, every accusation, every sarcastic comment. People learned the pattern. Then one day, the pattern stops. Someone tries to provoke an argument. You listen. You decide whether a response is necessary. If it is not, you move on. Someone makes a personal remark. Instead of defending yourself for 20 minutes, you simply recognize that the remark does not require an answer. Someone attempts to pull you into a disagreement. You refuse to participate. That change can feel strange to people who are familiar with your previous reactions. But there is an important distinction here. Being calm does not mean becoming emotionally unavailable. And refusing to argue does not mean automatically being correct. Stoicism is not a performance of indifference. It is the practice of giving your judgment a moment to lead before your impulse takes over. Epictetus placed great importance on examining the first impression that appears in the mind. Something happens. You feel the reaction. But there is a space between feeling the reaction and acting on it. That space is where self-command develops. Imagine someone pressing the same button repeatedly because they know it produces a reaction. For years, you responded immediately. Then you stop. The button is still being pressed, but nothing happens. Eventually, the other person has to decide whether continuing makes sense. This is why changing your reactions can alter a relationship without you saying much at all. You have removed the certainty of the old response. Marcus Aurelius understood that anger often creates additional problems rather than solving the original one. When someone behaves badly toward you, you still have choices. You can address the behavior. You can defend a legitimate interest. You can leave the situation. You can disagree firmly. But you do not have to surrender your composure simply because someone else has lost theirs. That distinction is especially valuable during conflict. Suppose someone sends you an insulting message. Your first instinct is to respond immediately. You type something sharp. Then you read it again. You make it sharper. You send it. Now the disagreement has become larger. A stoic pause changes the sequence. You read the message. You notice your reaction. You wait. Later you decide whether there is actually something worth answering. Perhaps there is. Perhaps there is not. Either way, the decision is yours rather than an automatic consequence of someone else's behavior. Seneca understood the danger of allowing anger to become the driver of action. Anger often creates urgency. It tells you that you must respond immediately. But urgency does not always mean importance. Sometimes the strongest response is a carefully chosen sentence. Sometimes it is a clear boundary. Sometimes it is silence. And sometimes it is simply leaving the conversation. The important part is that the response matches the situation rather than the intensity of your emotion. This is where people may notice that something has changed. They may say, "You're different now." Perhaps you are, but the goal was never to become difficult to provoke so that other people would feel powerless. The goal was to stop handing them automatic access to your behavior. That is a much more meaningful form of change. You do not need to win every argument. You do not need to correct every misunderstanding. Need to answer every accusation. You do not need to prove that you are right every time someone challenges you. Sometimes the most intelligent response is to decide that the conversation has no useful destination. Of course, there are situations where speaking matters. If someone has wronged you, address it appropriately. If a responsibility has been neglected, discuss it. If an important truth needs to be communicated, communicate it. Stoicism does not ask you to become passive. It asks you to become deliberate. There is a difference between choosing not to react and being unable to respond. One is discipline. The other is avoidance. When you develop the first, your behavior becomes much harder to predict because it is no longer controlled by the emotional atmosphere around you. Someone can be angry without making you angry. Someone can be impatient without making you impatient. Someone can misunderstand you without forcing you into endless explanations. You begin responding according to the situation, rather than according to the person standing in front of you. And that changes more than other people's expectations. It changes your relationship with yourself. You begin discovering that an emotion can be felt without being obeyed. that a provocation can be noticed without being answered, that a disagreement can exist without becoming a personal battle. The person who once reacted automatically is becoming someone who chooses. And once your reactions are chosen rather than triggered, other people's ability to predict and therefore influence them naturally becomes much smaller. There is a point in personal growth when you realize that not every decision needs a defense. You choose something, someone asks why, you explain. They question the explanation. You give another reason. They disagree with that reason, so you offer another. Before long, a simple decision has turned into a courtroom, and you are standing there trying to prove that you have the right to live your own life. This habit can be difficult to notice, because explaining yourself often feels like being reasonable. Sometimes explanation is appropriate. If your decision affects another person, communication matters. If you made a mistake, accountability matters. If someone deserves an honest explanation, give one. But there is a difference between communicating and seeking permission. The Stoics placed responsibility on the individual to examine their own judgment, rather than constantly looking outside themselves for confirmation. Epictetus understood that your decisions should ultimately be guided by your own reason. That does not mean ignoring advice. It means knowing when advice has been heard, and the decision now belongs to you. Consider something simple. You decide to spend less time socializing because you want to focus on an important responsibility. Someone asks, "Why don't you come out anymore?" You explain. They say, "You're taking things too seriously." You explain again. They say, "You have changed." Now you feel pressure to defend yourself. But what exactly are you defending? You made a reasonable decision about your own time. You do not need a committee to approve it. Marcus Aurelius often wrote about the importance of living according to reason, rather than being distracted by the judgments of others. That principle becomes especially valuable when your priorities change. People may understand. They may not agree. They may disagree. Their reaction does not automatically determine whether your decision was wise. The real question is whether you have examined it honestly. Was the decision responsible? Does it reflect your values? Have you considered the consequences? Are you willing to accept the results? If the answer is yes, endless explanation adds very little. Seneca understood that time is precious. Constantly defending yourself to people who have already decided what they think can consume enormous amounts of it. You explain. They misunderstand. You explain again. They reinterpret it. You become frustrated. Then you explain even more. Eventually the conversation is no longer about understanding. It is about convincing. And some people are not looking for information. They are looking for a reason to disagree. Recognizing that difference can save you a great deal of unnecessary effort. There is also another problem with excessive explanation. The more reasons you give, the more opportunities you create for someone to argue with you. Imagine saying, "I cannot attend tonight. I have something important to handle." That is enough. But if you add 10 explanations, someone can challenge each one. What about tomorrow? Can't you do it later? Why is that more important? You could come for an hour. Suddenly, your decision is being negotiated. Sometimes a simple statement protects clarity better than a long defense. This does not mean becoming cold. You can be polite. You can appreciate someone's concern. You can explain when explanation genuinely helps. But you do not need to turn every personal choice into a debate. There is a quiet confidence in being able to say, "I understand that you would choose differently," and then continue with your decision. That sentence contains no hostility. It simply acknowledges reality. You have your judgment, they have theirs. Both can exist without one person needing to defeat the other. This is where Stoicism differs from the modern idea that strength means making everyone understand you. Stoic strength is not measured by how many people you convince. It is measured partly by whether you can remain reasonable when someone does not agree. Epictetus would remind you that another person's opinion remains their possession. You do not have to carry it around as a problem. If someone misunderstands a reasonable choice, you can correct the misunderstanding if it matters. If it does not matter, you can leave it alone. If someone criticizes you fairly, listen. If someone criticizes you unfairly, consider whether there is anything useful, and then move forward. This creates a different kind of independence. You stop treating every question as a demand for justification. You stop believing that silence means guilt. You stop thinking that disagreement means you made the wrong choice. And you become more comfortable allowing other people to have incomplete opinions about you. They may never understand every decision you make. That is okay. You are not required to provide them with a complete explanation of your life. Your responsibility is to make thoughtful choices and accept the consequences of those choices. Once you understand that, something interesting happens. Your explanations become shorter. Your decisions become clearer. And other people's attempts to pull you back into endless justification lose much of their power. Not because you have learned how to control them, because you have stopped believing that you need their agreement before you are allowed to move forward. Sometimes people are comfortable with you not because they fully understand you, but because they understand the role you play in their life. You may have been the person who always listened, the one who always followed the group, the one who needed advice before making decisions, the one who depended heavily on another person's approval, the one who was always available. Then something changes. You become more responsible for your own choices. You develop different priorities. You become more selective about where your time goes. You start making decisions without automatically checking whether everyone around you agrees. Nothing about that requires you to become arrogant. But the relationship may feel different. And sometimes that difference is enough to expose an imbalance that had been there for years. This is one of the less obvious consequences of personal growth. Growth does not only change the person who is growing, it can change the way relationships function around them. Imagine two people who have always worked together in the same way. One person makes nearly every decision, the other usually follows. Neither person may have consciously designed the arrangement. It simply developed over time. Then the second person begins thinking independently. They start offering their own ideas. They disagree when they genuinely see things differently. They take responsibility for decisions instead of waiting to be directed. The first person may feel uncomfortable, not necessarily because the second person has done anything wrong. The old balance has simply disappeared. Marcus Aurelius understood that every person has a responsibility to govern their own mind. That principle leaves little room for building your identity entirely around another person's direction. You can respect someone without surrendering your judgment to them. You can value someone's experience without making them responsible for every decision you make. You can listen without becoming dependent. This distinction becomes especially important in friendships, families, workplaces, and partnerships. Healthy relationships can survive growth. In fact, healthy relationships often become stronger because both people continue developing. But relationships built heavily around dependency can become unstable when one person becomes more independent. That does not automatically make the other person bad. It simply reveals something about the structure of the relationship. Epictetus placed enormous importance on personal responsibility. You are responsible for the choices that belong to you. If you constantly expect another person to decide what you should do, you give away part of that responsibility. Eventually, taking it back may feel disruptive. But disruption is not always destruction. Sometimes it is adjustment. Suppose a friend has always been the person you call before making every important decision. Career, relationships, money, daily choices. Eventually, you realize that constantly asking for permission has prevented you from developing your own judgment. So you begin making your own decisions. Your friend may say, "You never used to be like this." Perhaps they are right. You are not. You are learning to stand on your own judgment. That does not mean you suddenly stop valuing their perspective. You can still ask for advice. The difference is that advice is no longer a substitute for your own responsibility. Seneca believed that a person should develop enough inner strength to stand independently rather than allowing circumstances or other people to determine their entire direction. That kind of independence can change relationships. Some people will appreciate it. They may even become more comfortable with you because the relationship becomes more equal. Others may struggle because the previous arrangement was convenient. And some relationships may gradually become less close. That can be painful. But not every change in a relationship means someone failed. Sometimes two people simply no longer fit the same pattern. The important thing is how you handle that transition. Do not humiliate people because you have grown. Do not constantly remind them that you have changed. Do not turn your progress into a reason to look down on those who are still where you once were. That would replace one form of dependence with another. Instead, remain respectful. Let your actions demonstrate the change. If you have become more disciplined, let your consistency speak. If you have become more independent, make responsible decisions. If you have become more thoughtful, listen before judging. If you have become more confident, do not needlessly prove it. This is where genuine growth becomes visible. You do not need to announce that the balance has changed. You simply stop participating in patterns that no longer make sense. And when another person reacts to that change, give them room to adjust. They may need time. They may ask questions. They may disagree. You can listen without automatically returning to the old version of yourself just to make the transition comfortable. A relationship worth preserving should have enough strength to survive two people becoming more fully themselves. If it cannot, the problem may not be that you changed. The change may simply have revealed what the relationship was actually built upon. And sometimes that realization is uncomfortable. But knowing the truth about a relationship is more valuable than preserving a comfortable illusion. At first, people may assume your new behavior is just a phase. You start waking up earlier. You become more careful with your time. You stop participating in the same arguments. You begin taking your responsibilities more seriously. Someone notices and thinks, they'll go back to normal soon. And sometimes they are right. Many changes disappear after a few days because they were driven by emotion rather than conviction. But something different happens when the change becomes consistent. Weeks pass, then months. You continue. The old version of you does not return. That is when other people may begin realizing that this is not a temporary mood. You have actually changed the way you live. This is important because people often understand us through history. They remember how we used to behave. If you were once extremely disorganized, they may continue expecting you to forget things. If you were once easily distracted, they may continue assuming you will abandon your plans. If you are always available, they may continue expecting immediate access to your time. A few new decisions do not immediately rewrite that history. Consistency does. Marcus Aurelius understood the importance of repeated practice. A principle becomes part of character when it is practiced repeatedly, especially when there is no audience to reward it. The same is true when you change. One disciplined morning does not transform your reputation. One calm response does not prove emotional maturity. One responsible decision does not establish reliability. But hundreds of ordinary choices begin creating evidence. People eventually have to respond to the evidence rather than the memory they have of you. Epictetus emphasized practice rather than merely talking about philosophy. That idea is valuable here. You do not need to convince anyone that you have changed. If you have genuinely changed, time will demonstrate it. Suppose you have spent years being late. Then you decide to become more reliable. You do not need to announce, I am a completely different person now. Just arrive on time. Again and again and again. Eventually, people stop wondering whether you will be late. They simply expect you to arrive when you said you would. Your behavior changed their expectations without requiring a speech. That is a much stronger form of change. The same principle applies to emotional reactions. Perhaps you used to become angry whenever someone disagreed with you. Now you pause. You listen. You respond more carefully. The first few times, people may test the old pattern. They may expect the familiar reaction. But if you continue responding differently, the old pattern loses its reliability. They cannot simply assume that pushing the same button will produce the same result. This is not about making someone powerless. It is about becoming less automatic. There is also an important warning here. Do not become obsessed with proving that your change is permanent. The moment you start performing your transformation for an audience, you are still allowing other people to influence your behavior. You do not need to make anyone notice. You do not need to post about every improvement. You do not need to explain your new habits. You do not need to tell people that you are finally becoming disciplined. Do the work. Let the evidence accumulate. Seneca understood that time reveals what temporary enthusiasm can hide. Anyone can make a promise during an emotional moment. Anyone can become motivated after hearing a powerful speech. Anyone can decide that tomorrow will be different. The difficult part is continuing when the excitement disappears. That is where change becomes credible. Maybe nobody notices your first month. Maybe someone even makes fun of your efforts. It doesn't matter. If the new behavior is genuinely better, its value does not depend on immediate recognition. Eventually, the results become difficult to ignore. The person who used to waste every evening is now building something. The person who constantly complained is now taking responsibility. The person who always needed reassurance is making decisions independently. The person who reacted to everything is becoming more deliberate. People may call this sudden, but it was not sudden. They simply noticed it late. This is one reason consistency is more powerful than announcement. Announcements tell people what you intend to become. Consistency shows them what you actually became. And there is something freeing about that. You no longer need to persuade people to believe in your growth. You do not need to argue with those who remember your past. You do not need to become frustrated when someone says you're still the same. Keep living differently. If the change is real, time will eventually make the argument for you. Not everyone will celebrate it. Some people may resist it. Some may continue expecting the old version of you. But you do not have to fight their expectations. Give them time to update their understanding. Your responsibility is much simpler. Keep becoming the person your actions are already beginning to reveal. There is a final stage of change that is easy to miss. At first, you change because something inside you has become uncomfortable. You recognize an old habit. You notice a pattern that is holding you back. You decide that you cannot continue living exactly as you have been. Then, as you begin changing, you may start watching other people's reactions. Do they notice? Are they surprised? Do they respect me more? Are they treating me differently? Do they regret how they treated me before? This is understandable. But if you remain focused on those reactions, something important has been missed. You may have changed your behavior while leaving your attention in the same place. You are still allowing other people to determine how meaningful your progress feels. The Stoics would challenge that. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly brought his attention back to his own conduct, not to the applause surrounding him, not to the opinions of people watching him, not to whether everyone understood his decisions. The standard was internal. Am I acting according to reason and virtue? That question matters because personal change becomes fragile when it depends on an audience. Imagine someone who begins exercising. At first, they are excited because people compliment their progress. Then the compliments stop. If recognition were the real motivation, the discipline may disappear. But if the person was exercising because they have decided to care for themselves, the absence of praise changes nothing. The behavior continues. The same principle applies to emotional growth. Maybe you have become calmer. Maybe you no longer argue over every disagreement. Maybe you are more disciplined with your time. Maybe you have learned to make decisions without constantly asking for approval. Those changes do not become less valuable because nobody comments on them. Their value comes from what they are doing to your life. Epictetus emphasized that a person's freedom depends partly on not placing their well-being in things they cannot command. Other people's reactions are outside that boundary. Someone may admire your change. Someone else may dislike it. Someone may never notice. Someone may misunderstand it completely. You cannot build lasting peace on something so unpredictable. This is where many people accidentally turn growth into another form of performance. They become disciplined, so others will notice. They become successful, so certain people will regret underestimating them. They become distant, so someone will miss them. They become confident, so someone will feel intimidated. But notice what has happened. The person appears independent on the outside while still being emotionally directed by the same people. The behavior changed, the dependency did not. Stoicism asks for something deeper. Change because the change is right. Become disciplined because discipline improves your life. Become calmer because reason serves you better than impulsive reactions. Become responsible because responsibility strengthens your character. Become more independent because you need to govern your own decisions. Then let other people respond however they choose. Seneca understood that a person should be concerned with the quality of their own life rather than constantly comparing themselves with others. That does not mean becoming indifferent to relationships. Human beings need cooperation, friendship, and community. But healthy relationships do not require you to constantly monitor someone's emotional response to your growth. You can care about someone without needing them to validate every change you make. You can listen to criticism without immediately abandoning your direction. You can accept disagreement without turning it into a personal crisis. And you can allow someone to misunderstand you without spending your entire evening trying to correct their opinion. This is where change becomes genuine. You no longer ask, "What will they think of me now?" You ask, "Am I living more wisely than I was before?" Harder question. Because you cannot answer it with likes, compliments, attention, or someone else's regret. You have to look at your actual behavior. Are you keeping your promises? Are you using your time well? Are you treating people fairly? Are you learning from mistakes? Are you becoming more capable of governing yourself? Those are better measures of growth. And sometimes the people around you will change their behavior when they realize that you have changed. Sometimes they will become more respectful. Sometimes they will become more distant. Sometimes they will try to bring back the old version of you. Sometimes they will simply move forward with you. You do not need to control which outcome occurs. Your responsibility is to remain thoughtful through all of them. That is the quiet power of genuine transformation. You stop changing to produce a reaction. You stop measuring your progress by whether someone finally understands you. You stop needing another person's discomfort, admiration, regret, or approval to prove that you are becoming stronger. You simply continue. Because when your direction comes from your principles, rather than other people's reactions, their response loses its ability to determine where you go next. And perhaps that is the most important change of all. Not that other people finally react differently to you, but that their reaction no longer decides who you become.